Welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us today for CSG Capitol Ideas Presents. I'm Joel Sams, a communications associate at CSG and managing editor of Capitol Ideas magazine. Today, we'll be talking about how states are allocating dollars from the American Rescue Plan Act Recovery Fund and preparing to use funds provided by the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Along with $1.9 trillion of economic relief package, this emergency funding has increased the portion of state government revenue coming from federal dollars to 36% in fiscal year 2020. This is the highest level on record and will continue to have an impact on state budgets and specific state policies enacted. During this webinar, we'll hear more about how states are using this influx of federal funds across the nation and how state leaders can make smarter budgeting decisions while balancing both short-term and long-term budgeting concerns. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the CSG State Talk blog early next week. The link will be in the chat. You can also request a link to the recording by emailing press@csg.org. To reduce noise, please stay on mute during the presentation. If you have questions, you can use the raise your hand function or leave us a note in the chat. We'll also save time after the presentation for a Q&A. If you have any technical difficulties, send me a message in the chat and I'll be happy to help. Thanks, Blair. Published 5 times each year, Capitol Ideas tells the story of leaders in the states and the public policy issues that matter right now. Our latest issue and past issues are available online at csg.org/publications/Capitol Ideas. The current issue features a profile on Washington Senator Sam Hunt, who serves as the CSG National Chair for 2022, a preview of this year's policy top issues, resources for understanding federal investments, and much more. If you don't already receive the print version of Capitol Ideas, and you'd like to, email us at capitolideas@csg.org, and we'll be happy to put you on the mailing list. Today, we're excited to hear from 2 experts who will share principles for making strategic budget decisions, offer an overview of how ARPA dollars are being used across the country, preview the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and consider how to better prepare for the future. Angela O is Senior Manager of the Pew Charitable Trust's State Fiscal Health Project, which helps states advance evidence-based policies that strengthen the finances of state and local governments and improve their long-term outlook. Sarah Needler, Director of Research here at CSG, manages member research requests, evidence-based policymaking initiatives, fiscal policy research, health policy projects, and the CSG Book of the States. Thank you both for being here. And Sarah, you can take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel, and welcome everyone. Good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today to talk about state budgets and federal funding that's going to the states. As we all know, state budgets have faced a lot of uncertainty over the past 2 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic and a new COVID-19 variant creating spikes in positive tests in some parts of the country, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine have exacerbated this economic and budgetary uncertainty. State leaders must now decide how to rebuild their economies, allocate federal funding, and plan for the future. And state leaders must consider both the short-term and long-term responses to continuing concerns about COVID, as well as long-term budgeting concerns. So now is really an opportunity to consider how best to develop state budgets capable of mitigating public health-related and other challenges in the future. As Joel said, we're going to share information today about how states are utilizing federal funds from ARPA and from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to make budgeting decisions, and then also think more strategically about balancing both short and long-term budgeting decisions. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm going to get us started before passing things over to Angela and talk a little bit about how states have been using American Rescue Plan Act and Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act funding. As you can see here, and Joel mentioned, the percentage of state revenue by source, by federal funds in particular, has increased over time. As you can see in fiscal year 2020, 36% of state revenue came from federal funding. And this is an all new record high. And more states are relying on federal funds. Federal funds were the largest source of dollars in 18 states in fiscal year 2020, and that's up from 4 states just a year earlier. And a lot of this funding is increased reliance on federal funding is coming from emergency federal funding that are addressing the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. And this has really increased the amount of funding that states are receiving through the ARPA and through IIJA. Next slide. You can see here that the American Rescue Plan Act, which was signed in March 2021 for $1.9 trillion, and then the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA, which we'll call it in this presentation today, for $1.2 trillion. And in the American Rescue Plan Act, more specifically breaking that funding down, there is $350 billion that went to state and local governments in the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Out of that $350 billion, 195 of that has gone to states and the District of Columbia. And this funding is relatively discretionary in nature. It must be used to address the public health response or negative economic impacts from the public health emergency, or to replace lost public sector revenue, or finally to pay premium pay for essential workers. But within those confines, states have a lot of flexibility on how to use those funding. With the Infrastructure Act, there is $550 billion in new funding that has been established for infrastructure investments over the next 5 years. So as you can see, there's a large influx of federal funding. Next slide. At CSG, we've been thinking about how we can best support states in using this increase in federal funding. And so we've developed a website, which you can see here on this slide, web.csg.org/recovery, where we've put a variety of resources to provide support to state leaders to think about what's in the ARPA, what's in IIJA, and how can states spend that funding. As part of that work, we've done a series of briefs and analyses that you can find on that website, as well as created this state ARPA utilization database. What we did was conducted a 50-state scan of the allocation of ARPA funds, and this is specifically focused on that fiscal recovery fund that I mentioned earlier, or the direct funding going to states. This data was collected by analyzing state actions, enacted legislation that was appropriating ARPA funding, as well as looking at state recovery plan performance reports that were submitted to Treasury. And this work was also done in collaboration with our partners at NASBO, or the National Association of State Budget Officers. So NASBO helped us send all of this data that we collected to state budget offices for validation before we included it in the state ARPA utilization database. We're happy to work with NASBO and happy to have them on this webinar with us as well. And in this database, if you navigate to this web page, you will navigate to the part of the page that says state utilization of federal funds, and that's where you'll find this database. You can view the data by state, so you can actually see how each specific state has allocated funds, or you could look at the funding by category. In each one of these views, you'll be able to find information on specific state allocations, the category or broad policy area of spending, the authority, so whether this was a legislative or executive authority, a summary of the allocation, as well as the authorizing language or the specific language included in the bill or executive order, as well as the amount budgeted and the distributing entity and the method for distribution. Next slide. And today I wanted to share with you some of the key findings that we have from that ARPA database and how states are thinking about using ARPA funding. So you can see here a map of how the percentage of how much of the funding allocated to each state has been spent. So states have received state recovery funds by, first, they are insured a minimum of $500 million. And then additional funding is allocated to each state based off of the share of unemployed workers over a 3-month period between October to December 2020. So each state is receiving a slightly different amount of funding from the State Fiscal Recovery Fund. And you can see here, this map is showing what percentage of that funds that each state is receiving that has been allocated so far. And you can see in this map that states are at various levels and various stages of allocating ARPA funding. There are some states who have allocated all of their funds and some that have allocated none of their funds yet. And when this map was created, and this is data through November of 2021, this map you can see shows that 4 states have actually allocated 100% of their funding, and that was Indiana, Massachusetts, Montana, and Wisconsin. But there are also several other states that were in the 90s or approaching completion of allocation. Then also there were several states that had not allocated any funds, as you can see. And I did want to note that since this map was created, we do know that Delaware, North Carolina, and North Dakota have also allocated funds in the 2021 session that aren't yet reflected on this map or in the database, but will be in the next week or two. And the deadline for spending these funds is December 31st, 2024. So there are still plenty of time and opportunities for states to allocate this funding. Next slide. Great. As you can see here, I wanted to also break down the funding by policy area or broad category of spending. If you look at this here, you can see that the 2 largest buckets of funding are in revenue and taxation. That's about 22% of the allocations, as well as management and administration, and that's about 21% or $20 million. We can see then in that second column that that's followed up by funding in unemployment, broadband and IT, education, economic and community development, housing, and health and human services. But out of those 2 largest buckets, the one on revenue and taxation, wanted to note that only about 3% of that funding is actually for specific tax or revenue related allocations, like refunding local governments. The majority of that funding is actually with states using the revenue replacement calculation or the revenue replacement option, where they are providing funding for ongoing government services. And we at CSG are planning to conduct further analysis on how states are using that revenue replacement option in the next few weeks. And we'll have that information on the website and we'll share that with you as well. And if you look at the database, it does narrow down the spending based off of these general policy areas, but you can also filter it down more specifically on program. So we have a variety of programs listed in the database, and so many that I could not fit them all on this slide, but wanted to mention that if you want to really get into the details, that the database does have that information. Next slide. And one final way to look at the data and how states are spending ARPA funding is to look at how many states have allocated funds in each one of these broader policy areas. So you can see here that the most states have allocated are in economic and community development, with 25 states having made allocations in that policy area, as well as health and human services, where 24 states have allocated funds around health and human services. And you can kind of see narrowing down here what some of the other policy areas are, but wanted to highlight a few examples for how states are using that funding in those first 2 categories. In economic and community development, there are wide ranges of areas and how states are using this funding to address unique economic challenges within their communities. There are some larger projects focused on tourism or the entertainment industry, airports, or small business programs. But there's a lot of also really small intentional allocations to things like cinemas or little league teams or bus tours. One example of how Colorado is spending some of their funding for economic and community development is on the Colorado Startup Loan Program. This is a revolving loan and grant program that's using $10 million of ARPA funding, as well as $30 million of state general funds to promote the program to business owned by women, veterans, minorities, rural and underserved or disadvantaged communities. Vermont has also allocated funding for outreach and technical assistance for BIPOC-owned businesses. And I'm highlighting a couple of examples that are specifically focused on equity, inclusion, and that's because this is really a focus of how states are spending ARPA funding. And one way in which CSG is trying to provide support to states is trying to think about how to include equity in these allocations. And for health and human services, a few examples there. First, it's important to note, I think, that about 20% of the funding allocations in health and human services have been directed towards behavioral and mental health, which is something that has been great for us to see and to provide support to state leaders when thinking about that. Some examples of state allocations in health and human services includes $1 million, and this is in Maine, $1 million to the Permanent Commission on the Status of Racial, Indigenous, and Tribal Populations. And this is to support the development of a strategy and one-time investments in public health infrastructure to reduce disparities in outcomes in minority groups. And another example is in Michigan, $4.4 million has been allocated to provide physical and behavioral health services to multicultural populations. And these are just a few examples that I want to share. There's several examples that are included in the utilization database, as well as CSG plans to share a variety of articles over the next several months about best practices of how states are allocating this funding. Next slide. And although we don't have quite as much information yet on how states are using the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IIJA funding, I wanted to make sure to still address what that funding is here and some examples of how states are starting to think about that. The IIJA establishes $550 billion in new spending, and the breakdown of that funding can be seen in this slide here. The biggest amount of funding, or $284 billion, is going for transportation. And transportation includes roads and bridges, public transit, rail, safety, airports, ports and waterways, electric vehicle chargers, electric buses, and reconnecting communities. So there's quite a bit falling underneath that transportation category. There's also $73 billion dedicated to power grids and utilities, $65 billion to broadband deployment in cybersecurity, $55 billion for drinking water and wastewater, $46 billion for resiliency measures. And this includes things like wildfire mitigation and prevention of and flood mitigation assistance. $21 billion is dedicated to environmental remediation, and that includes things like weatherization assistance, carbon utilization grant programs, and other programs addressing resiliency. And then $8 billion in Western water storage and public lands. Next slide. And you can see here is an example of how states are starting to think about spending IIJA funding. And this is actually an example that's coming from close to home, coming to you all from Kentucky. And this is a bridge, the Brent Spence Bridge, which is also a tongue twister to say that multiple times. It's a bridge that connects Kentucky to Ohio over the Ohio River. And Governor Beshear and Governor DeWine have signed a memorandum of understanding, confirming their intention to work together to work on a bridge project for the Brent Spence Bridge. And the goal of this project is to significantly reduce traffic congestion on and around the bridge. Governors are planning to work together and to apply to IIJA funds to complete this project. And this is just one example of how states are starting to think about and starting to work together on using some of this competitive grant funding for infrastructure investments. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Angela. I hope this gave you kind of a broad overview of how states are starting to think about using federal funding, but more importantly, how states are starting to think about incorporating this funding into their budgeting decisions, both for the short term in addressing the pandemic, as well as how to incorporate that into the long term. So I'm going to turn things to Angela, and she's going to talk to us a little bit more about how state leaders can make efficient and effective budgeting decisions while balancing both the short term and the long term. Angela?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I'm just waiting for my slides to pop up. But yes, as Sarah mentioned, I will talk primarily about fiscal principles that policymakers and their staff can think through so that they're making better long-term budget decisions, knowing that sometimes there's a focus on the immediacy of how do we just get through that current budget cycle. So next slide, please. Okay, so Pew is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts research and analysis to improve public policy. I specifically work on the State Fiscal Health Project, which helps advance data-driven best practices to build fiscally well-managed states. And we also provide targeted technical assistance in states in such as areas such as long-term budgeting, which we'll talk more about today, as well as stress testing, rainy day fund policy, contingency planning, anything budget related, that's kind of our wheelhouse. Next slide, please. Okay, so today I want to focus on two key things of why thinking long-term matters, as well as fiscal principles to make those better decisions over the long run. So why think long-term? So budgets can be balanced in the short run, but still be structurally unsound over the long run. And we can see this in real time. As Sarah alluded to, like this large influx of federal aid, many states are now flush with cash, but this flow of revenue may not be available in future years. And so it's something for states to think about of, while we're flush right now, what does our budget look like in the future? And are we making any spending commitments that we cannot keep pace with once this one-time money runs out? And then thinking through, would there be an impact in services that states provide without a future funding stream to make that up? And then second, identifying potential budgetary hurdles in advance. That way policymakers can implement long-term solutions to long-term problems. Importantly, to avoid some of those short-sighted decisions when having to balance the budget immediately, not realizing that without addressing a structural issue, states could be compounding issues and then leading to more undesirable outcomes in the future. And I think, as we all know, fiscal risks continue to grow in states, realizing that shrinking revenue streams and increasing costs are becoming more and more common, as well as broader challenges that states are having to face, such as an increase in the frequency or severity of natural disasters, population-based pressures, as well as technical advancements. Next slide, please. Okay, so here I just wanted to illustrate kind of that short-term lens versus long-term. And so yeah, this is just a pure mock scenario. It's not looking at any one state, and it's not tied to real numbers. But on the left side, we have what we would kind of show as a temporary downturn. And then if we were focusing on, let's say, one funding stream, let's say sales tax. So in a current year, we might see that revenue looks good in that blue line. And then for that next year, and then year 3 and 4, that there's still a shortfall, but it's starting to close. And then by year 5 and 6, we see that our theoretical revenue has come back up. So we might, as policymakers or staffers, think that we're in the clear, we got through that really hard time, which is always great, knowing that there's that immediate need that states need to address. But once we start kind of factoring in some longer term issues of, are we identifying potential policy effects? Have we incorporated those broader challenges? Are we thinking about the comprehensive budget, not just one particular funding stream? Then we might get to see some of those structural imbalances that would continue to grow over time if policymakers aren't thinking of solutions right now to kind of tackle some of this. And that is something that Pew's research has been more and more focused on is, while the short term is important and we know that states need a balance in that current fiscal year, what about those out years? And then what happens if things such as a pandemic happens that we weren't necessarily prepared for, but we have to be in real time? Next slide, please. Okay, so here is where we'll spend the majority of our time on. So these are 6 budget principles that Pew's research has identified for best practices when constructing a long-term budget and thinking through some of those decisions. And so we'll start at that top center and then kind of work our way clockwise. And I'll walk through each principle in more detail. So the first of which is analyzing major revenue sources and spending categories. And this kind of points back to the last slide that had that temporary downturn versus structural imbalance. So we want to make sure that states are looking at the overall budget, not just 1 or 2 funding streams. Of some states may have that look of, let's just focus on our general fund or our education fund. But as Sarah had pointed out in some of her slides, ARPA in many states is now a significant budget driver. And so with that being the case, we want states to look at a comprehensive picture of revenues and expenditures, and then understanding how those may interplay with each other. For example, if one funding stream may be coming in under forecast, does that put pressure in other buckets to kind of offset that? Or if it's, say, a transportation fund that is then decreasing, what does that mean for transportation in the operating side, as well as like new infrastructure? Some of those areas to think about when looking at full, complete revenues and expenditures. And then next, looking ahead at least 3 years. So a minimum we say is 3 years. That way budget projections can capture more than just one budget cycle. And this would apply to states that budget on either an annual or a biannual basis. And again, pointing back to that, why does long-term thinking matter? It's so that we can start to see and identify trends early on and make some of these decisions ahead of time, and then not doing things kind of on the fly, not understanding the ramifications of some of these. And also by looking ahead that over that 3-year period, we can then start understanding, knowing that population-based pressures are a real thing. In years 4, 5, and 6, what does it mean for Medicaid or other health and human service programs if our state is graying, things like that. The next, estimating the baseline budget. So again, it is revenues and expenditures, and then using kind of a current services approach. And so something that we have seen in states is they might say that, well, based on our current trajectory, we can afford at least the next 1 or 2 years, but that might be looking at something that's flat, saying like a conservative, our budget might grow 1.5% or 2% each year. But a current services baseline approach is going to look at if the state is providing the same quantity and quality of services as the current budget period, is that feasible and affordable for the state? And it would take into account things such as inflation, cost per person. Think about, again, like Medicaid or public education funding, and then anything that might potentially require a statutory change if it was not met. And then by understanding that current services baseline, is the state in kind of a budget surplus or budget deficit, is an area to always consider. And then next, accounting for the effects of policy changes. And so as we kind of talked about in that looking ahead at least 3 years, while that's important and in that we're kind of doing this baseline approach, We also then want to like layer in this the factor of policy changes that we know are going to either go in effect or a proposal. And something that we're seeing right now is states that are either proposing or enacting tax cuts. So if we know state revenue may fall by, let's say, like 10% of the budget because of enacted policy change, that is going to need to be included in any sort of long-term budget projection. And that's kind of creating our new baseline or that new estimate to kind of work towards. And then next, distinguishing between one-time and ongoing revenue and spending. And this is to estimate if there is a structural surplus or structural deficit. And so if we're kind of lumping all of our money, whether it's one-time and ongoing, into kind of one pot, it may mask if there's an underlying financial situation that we're not aware of, or we may not fully understand what we can or cannot pay for in the future. And so one thing, as Pew has been doing research and kind of tracking what states are doing, it has never been our intent to say that states should only spend one-time money on one-time expenses, but more, have you done the analysis to understand if you're using your ARPA funds on an ongoing commitment, how would you then backfill that money after funds are allocated and expended, knowing that some things, even if it's one-time in nature, there may be associated maintenance costs with, say, a new building or other infrastructure projects. So understanding that dynamic and then separating out this can help a state uncover those trends that may be occurring early on. And then lastly, identifying key factors. And so we also feel that it's not just important for states to know if their budget is structurally sound, but why or why not. So one area that I think about here are states that might potentially be more like tourism dependent economies or natural resource dependent economies. They may not always follow national trends, and certain things may be more or less in a state's control. So understanding how some of those factors can impact the state are important as they make future decisions. As we all know, with the pandemic and like national shutdowns, there was a lot that was not in states' control early on. And as we're kind of working towards what would be our new normal and addressing this constant uncertainty, thinking about how these 6 principles work together and then also can kind of stand alone. We just want states to be able to use these to make some of those better long-term budget decisions, whether it's implementing a new program or if it's considering tax cuts that we're starting to see more and more of, just kind of always looking towards these budget principles. Then next slide. Here is just my contact information in case there's any follow-up questions related to long-term budgeting or any of our other work, such as budget stress testing. So that's all I have. So I will turn the time back over to Joel.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I'd invite all of our guests to use the raise your hand function if you'd like to ask any questions, or you can drop your questions in the chat. In the meantime, Angela, while we're waiting on some questions to come in, I'd like to just ask you, what are some of the successes that you've seen in the states in implementing these principles of long-term and short-term budgeting?
Mm-hmm. So I would say one thing, so I just had to double check that I wasn't still muted. So one thing that I think we're starting to see are states that have like enacted some of those tax cuts, if they've associated an analysis behind that of, right, Pew is a nonprofit and like nonpartisan. We're never ever advocating that states do or do not do something related to their own constituents, but we just want to see that analyses are being done and that states are kind of doing that long-term budget projection as well as a stress test so that they know when a downturn does occur, what can they afford or what budget maneuvers would they be willing to make? So something like that, like Utah, also my home state, but they're a great example of a state that does that long-term budget projection as well as a stress test to have that comprehensive view of what would we do now in the immediacy of, would we tap our rainy day funds? Would we do any sort of revenue enhancements before kind of thinking about any other type of budget maneuvers? So several states are doing more and more of this type of work. So I hope that answers it.
It does. I'd also be curious, without naming names, what are some of the most overlooked of the principles that you mentioned for long-term budgeting? What are the things that people miss the most often?
Yeah, without naming names, I think one large one is maybe overly focusing on the revenue side of things. And so we might see states do really, really good revenue projections, but less comprehensive on the expenditure side. And they might just say, well, Medicaid's a large driver, we're only going to look at that. And so while it's still a good analysis, it's not comprehensive. And that's why we always say revenues and expenditures. And that's an area I think it's kind of hard, and states may think that it's in their control, so they can focus less. But we just think you're not telling the full picture if both aren't being equally analyzed.
Very good. Are there any state strategies that hit that sweet spot that can address both the short term and the long term together?
I mean, that's a hard one. I think, like, when you say the sweet spot, I think that's like tricky for me, of knowing many states have those balanced budget requirements that require them to at least balance like the operating side of things. So while that of course is very much important, it's that, is there any sort of compounding problem? And I think states don't necessarily have to have like that 10-year budget that's balanced, but are they understanding, by year 3 or year 4, we see that our sales tax is shrinking, but our costs are growing. How are we either going to make up that revenue or restructure and do things? And so I think that's what's hard of, there's that immediate need to balance, but if things aren't addressed right now, is it going to compound that problem later? And then you're going to have a bigger mess to unwind. And I think also what's hard is, with many policymakers, there's just so many demands upon them. And so it's, how can they work together more effectively, and then think about not just one budget cycle, which, I mean, I worked in a fiscal office a couple of years ago, and it was so hard because sessions move so quickly and there's so many demands. I think it's easy to lose sight of 5 years down the road when it's like, we have to close this fiscal year and we have 100 million more requests than we have dollars for. So I don't know if that necessarily answered it, but
Yes, it did. And again, I'd reiterate for our folks joining us today, go ahead and unmute, jump in, raise your hand, put a question in the chat. While we have our experts here, we'd love to hear more from them. And I wonder if you can give me any other examples of state successes that we've seen as we go through reporting. This is for you, Sarah, in our ARPA database. What are some of the standout examples of states really doing innovative things and using these funds really well?
Sure. And I know I'm also joined on this call by a couple of our partners at NASBO, as well as my colleague, Christina Gordley, who has worked a lot on this database as well. So just want to invite them to also feel free to jump in and share examples. I know we've seen many examples of things, and so I'm sure what pops to mind to some of us is different than others. But for me, I think one thing that I have been excited to see is around implementing measures to incorporate evidence-based policymaking into some of these funding decisions. So I know, for example, Colorado has been thinking about how to tie performance metrics to the budgeting process. And this has been something that's been incorporated in their recovery plans for state ARPA funding. And I know other states are also starting to think about evidence-based policymaking and how to make that part of the system. So when deciding how to allocate funds systematically, not just ARPA funding or IIJ funding, but how to incorporate data and research into that. How do we know that the programs that we're investing in are actually going to have an impact for residents and constituents of that state? So that's been something exciting for me to see, and how state funds or federal funds are being used by states. Like I said, Christina or Stacy or Catherine, feel free to jump in with any other examples.
I'd open it up to any other audience members too who have examples to share of funding in your states, successes you've seen, how ARPA funds are being used, IIJA funding. What are some of the great things that you've seen? If anyone cares to jump in. No? Okay, back to you, Angela, with one burning question. As you work with state leaders, what are some of the biggest questions you get about budgeting? Maybe in terms of like, in terms of the categories of things people come to you, what are some of the things that rise to the top that are the most pressing concerns? And what do you say to that?
So I think one big one is almost that like forecasting the future of, before the pandemic, it's always like we had this long period of economic growth. So it was always, when is the next recession going to hit? How large will it be? And so I will say this is a little bit of a plug for some of our work with stress testing of, well, we as Pew, we cannot predict how large or when the next recession would be, but understanding what states can afford and then comparing that kind of against contingencies. And so like with stress testing, it's this high level of kind of building on a long-term budget, but what does a state have available in the event of like a moderate or severe recession? So knowing that revenue will fall and expenditures will increase, kind of adding that up and then comparing it to reserves and other contingencies is something that we always tell states, like it's a great exercise. And while it's not predicting the future, it can kind of be that gut check to say, you would handle a moderate recession for 3 years perfectly fine, but by year 4, you might have to consider more programmatic cuts or revenue enhancements. And so that's kind of one of those key questions is, how is our budget doing? What can we do kind of to shore up that we will be okay? And I think more recently, which is of course equally hard, is like, what do we predict after fiscal 26 of kind of like when all of this federal money kind of dissipates, what does our budget look like? And I think that's just a hard one that we just don't know what's going to happen, and no one could have predicted this. And so it's kind of that, yes, we all need to be thinking long-term, understanding that there are broad challenges, but there's always just going to be a level of uncertainty with state budgeting that we can't account for, which is, I think it's hard for us to say, and we wish we had a better solution, but it's kind of just the nature of what we have to deal with in our world.
Very good. Well, I think that's going to conclude our webinar for today. I thank you all for being here. Thanks to you, Angela and Sarah, for sharing your expertise with us. And you can all look for this presentation on our State Talk blog again early next week. And any research questions that come out from the states, people looking for assistance, can go to Sarah Needler at, I'm sorry, Sarah, you put that in the chat. I don't want to say it wrong.
No problem. It's sneedler@csg.org. You can also email research@csg.org.
Thank you. There it is. Thank you all for joining, and have a great rest of your day.